Well, what I was hoping to do is we're going to start talking about pop art today properly, and we'll be talking mostly about two artists, Robert Rauschenberg. We'll start off with Richard Hamilton, but we're talking mostly about Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. And what I had hoped to do was to show you some snippets of a film that was made in 1972 called Painter's Painting. And it really covers abstract expressionism through pop art. And it's basically a series of interviews with artists in their studios talking about their work. And it's really interesting. And you'll find that oftentimes when you see quotes from some of these artists or snippets of them talking in other documentaries, it's drawn from this film. So it's a really significant film. So I'm going to try and problem solve whatever's going on with the sound. And we'll catch up with that on Friday. And actually, when I was trying to figure out how to incorporate the film, I wasn't sure whether I should show you that first and then talk about the work, or talk about the work and then show it to you, because I can see benefits to doing both. So technology failure, made the choice, for me. So keep in mind. So we'll talk about work today, and then we'll look at parts of the next time. I did want to start out with this work here. This is work by Richard Hamilton, who was a British artist, primarily known as a painter, and he was the large portion of his, or his best known work from the 60s, really, are paintings that come from stills, sort of like film stills, but he painted them in a photorealistic way, but they also look like negative images as well. So they're these really strange, kind of surreal, and kind of trippy, if you want to think of them in a 1960s sense, type of images, but derived from media because the images are derived from film. This work that he creates in the mid-1950s is sometimes thought of as where the word pop art comes from. But keep in mind that this terminology of pop art comes from a number of different sources. It's a term that gets used pretty rapidly. Some scholars think that there was a review of an exhibition of a show in New York by, I think her name is Barbara, something, I'll track that down, that she uses the term pop art pretty early as well, so some people attribute its first usage there. But there are a number of people using this term right around the same time period. And what we're looking at here is not a painting, but it's a collage. All of the pieces of the collage that you see here, the image in total, comes from media. In particular, it comes from print media, magazines, primarily like magazines and comic books as well. And the title of it is a question, right? So the question is, just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing? And it's important, I think, to look at this within the context of the time frame. 1956, it's about 10 years after the end of World War II. Richard Hamilton's a British artist, but he's essentially making commentary on American culture, because you see references to American things. There are American products, basically, that are being represented here. So this isn't necessarily an image of a European household, but it's an image of an American household. And if we think about this question, I'm sorry, before I come back to the idea of the question, the other thing to keep in mind, too, is that during World War II, European industries, ramp up for the war effort. American industry ramps up for the war effort. After World War II, Europe is goes into a period of having to rebuild itself, right? The United States, because of the literal damage from the war itself. For the United States, we didn't have infrastructure damage. So, the country itself, is intact. You've got these industries that have been in, high gear for several years. And what happens in we refer to as that post-war period, is that a lot of industries that were producing, objects and material for the war effort shift toward producing consumer goods. And so you've got a number of things at play. You've got the United States, which has just become a superpower for the first time in its history. You've got industry producing all of these materials. You've got soldiers who are coming home and the GI Bill is in effect. The GI Bill basically enables, like huge numbers of people to go to college who would never been able to be able to afford to do that before. So the economy is really booming. You've got an increasingly educated, workforce. So everything is kind of running at full tilt, and you also have companies that are producing all of these objects and all of these things that people can buy. This idea of the American dream being a little house and a white picket fence and 2.5 kids and 2 cars, and so on, is all developed in this time frame. Basically that of the 1950s. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as you look at this image. So if we come back to the question, just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? How do you answer that question, or how does this image answer that question? I guess it's a better way of putting it.
Like it exemplifies consumerism.
Yeah, it exemplifies, or could you use another adjective even? It's an example of consumerism. Do you feel like it's glorifying consumerism in some way? Yeah. Because this image is all about consumerism, or about this idea of consumption. So, and that's another thing. And it is. We can look at it in the past, but it is relevant to our current times. There's a really good. It's about like a 15 or 20 minute animated film called The Story of Stuff. Is anybody familiar with it? It's pretty interesting. What it does is, in a really cogent way, it's the story of things, it's the story of stuff. I can't remember which it is. But it basically talks about the development of consumer culture after the war. And it talks about the economists who developed it and so on. In this post-war period, there are a number of American economists who developed this idea, basically, of this sort of infinite consumption loop, that products should be developed, marketed to people. Industry should, basically, the cycle is industry should make products that people want, that eventually will become disposable, and that what will keep the economy running is that it just continues to pump out all of this material. And so what you realize as you kind of watch this film, and it's well documented, you can put all their sources, or you can access all the sources on their website. You realize that it's kind of crazy, and we're beginning to see. Within our time, we're seeing that system fall apart, basically, because the problem is this economic model is based on infinite resources, but now we have a better understanding that our resources are finite, and the system eventually will break down, and we're starting to see that break down now, which is only just, a few, if we think of it, it's a half a century or so later. But it's this idea of infinite resources, consumption. You need all of these things, right? And so when you look at this imagery, you're being marketed in a way to want all of these things. So when you look at this image and think about this glorification of consumption, everything that you see here, for the most part, is some kind of consumer object. Did you have a question? Or comment? Or sorry? Oh, no? Oh, yeah, I thought I heard something. Sorry. So if you look at the individual objects, one is you've got this, nicely decorated house, right? And, mid-century modern design, some very contemporary things. You've got, in terms of the furniture and so on. You've got, nice objects, we've got art. Actually, we'll start with that because it's probably the most traditional thing. If we look at the art that's hanging on the walls, what kind of art is on the walls?
Traditional, I would think, like a comic.
Yeah. You want to add something else to Aubrey? Did you say something?
I was going to say a portrait and then comic.
Yeah, it's kind of like this is the it's this crazy technology. No, laser pointer's not working. Okay. Well, I'll point at things. That means I'll look at shit. Okay, I'm now the irritated. So we've got this painting on the right-hand side that's like totally traditional, right? It's like a 19th century portrait of an individual. Then you've got this other, it's depicted as a painting, but it's really cut out from a comic book, a true romance. But if you think about the history of painting, it's a narrative painting, right? And so there's this kind of narrative that plays out. The one thing to consider, too, is what he's literally doing, placing side by side, is high culture and low culture that's been elevated to the role of high culture. And we'll see this continually, or this kind of theme continually among the pop artists. And it's important to keep in mind that today, when we think about, say, graphic novels or comic books, they have a lot of value. They're something that's increasingly, significant within our culture. But even, old comic books today, we think of them as having valuable because people collect them. People assign value to them, like an old, first edition of a particular comic book may be actually worth a lot of money or be very, intrinsically valuable to people who are interested in them. But in the context of 1956, comic books are disposable. They're printed on newsprint. They're printed, really, really cheaply. They're cheap. And they're also things that kids read. They're not serious stuff that adults read or adults look at. So the way people would have thought about comic books in 1956 is very different than the way we think about it today. So they belong to what we traditionally think was low culture, whereas painting, art, portraiture, and so on is high culture. So we're seeing those literally side by side. You see a reference, you don't see a car, but you see a reference to it. The table lamp that you see here has an emblem, it says Ford, that comes, you'd expect to see it on a vehicle, so it's referred to even if you don't see the vehicle itself. The image itself is made up of print media, but it's also making references to new media, which is television. In the mid-1950s, about 50% of households, I think it's about 50%, I'm going to double check that, but it's about 50% of households have television. So it's becoming, increasingly popular, and it's brings a whole new dynamic into itself. We also have this device down here too, which is another kind of media. Does anybody know what this is or recognize this? Old technology, analog technology for us today. Yeah.
Recording device.
Yeah, it's a reel-to-reel tape, and it could be recording, it could be playback, depending on the exact model. This would be the equivalent of a digital music player today, where it's small and portable, right? This thing probably weighed 20 pounds, right? But compared to other recording equipment, and the reason I say, a digital, because certainly records existed, and records are pretty cheap and inexpensive. But reel-to-reel tape was really high quality in the same way we think of that difference, in quality of sound between analog and digital. So notably, this is kind of up front and center. This is very exciting, for people to be able, if you're really interested in music, and or you were involved in the professional world, this is the kind of device that you would want to have. Like a record player just wouldn't necessarily cut it. It seems, kind of certainly outmoded to us today. There's also a reference to film and movies as well. So if you look through the window, you see a marquee, and on that marquee is a reference to a film. Actually, kind of, even in this time frame, is an old film, like an Al Jolson film from I think it's from like the late 20s or 1930s or so. So there's this reference. So we've got film, television, music, print media, and all those things. But we also have these consumer objects like the vacuum cleaner, right, which is currently so fabulous because it has this long extension, so you can you can vacuum up the stairs because you've got wall-to-wall carpeting, which is a post-war invention, and not have to carry this thing along with you. But there's also things too that seem kind of innocuous to us, like the this canned ham, right? And so on one hand, you might look at it today, and that seems so common. To have these, kind of packaged food products for us today. But things like canned ham and packaged food, we think of today as processed food or convenience foods, those also are heavily developed and marketed after World War II. And it's a good example of how wartime industry translates into peacetime industry, because the packaging of food is something that was very, very important during World War II in order to feed the troops. You had to be able to, have, quality food, a certain number of calories and so on. And all that technology developed through the war then gets shifted, into the consumer culture. The one thing I'm talking around the edges of are the two figures, right? And so one of the things, if we think about all of the products or the items that we're seeing here, they're essentially all about desire. They're all about wanting things, especially within this time frame. And so if you think about it, all of these images are coming from print media and coming from advertising mostly. And the goal of advertising is to make you want something, right? Whether it's to buy into an idea, or more likely to make you want a product, whatever that may be, whether it's the canned ham or a car or a television or wall-to-wall carpeting or whatever that is. And when we see the figures placed in this image, there's also this element of desire, and it works in a number of ways. You could either desire, those individual, people or representations of those people, in a sexual way at one level, or you might desire to be like them, to look like them, perhaps be, and it's a strange image of the woman like some kind of dancer or something like that. But the man who's standing is notable because he's a bodybuilder, and it's also during the 1950s that Charles Atlas becomes very well known. And he was this sort of like fitness guru of the 50s who basically had this, system for, for developing your muscles and looking like him, essentially, which was pretty much like this guy here. And so he was marketing this, this training, this training system. And that was something that was really kind of a new idea as well. And then, so desire, we can see desire come into play in all sorts of different ways in this image. And then on top of it, he's holding this Tootsie Pop, which some people, feel a little uncomfortable, or some scholars have looked at it and you can tell it makes them uncomfortable. They refer to it as being kind of phallic. Others refer to it as being like a tennis racket. It's probably how you refer to that is you could kind of do Freudian analysis maybe, but how you refer to it probably says a lot more about the person looking at it, perhaps than the image itself. But it's an intriguing image to look at, and it makes a nice image to kind of kick off a discussion of pop art because there's so much that's jam packed into this, into this particular scene. The other thing too, I'm curious, how many of you have, and I think you might do this in a design class, how many of you have had an assignment where you have to sort of cut and piece images together and make almost, your goal is to make realistic space. Does that describe the assignment?
Yeah.
Pretty well.
Yeah, Amy did.
Yeah, and it's a pretty standard like 2D design project, and it comes from this work. This is my thinking on it because this is very this is really well known. This idea of taking all of these disparate things and making them look like you're making a construction of space like a traditional painting. But there's nothing, certainly really traditional about this. So again, the idea that's really, underpinning this is that or things we can think about is using new materials in new ways, referencing, the old ways of doing things, but again, doing them in new ways. But also this incorporation of, of the moment, of contemporary culture. All of the various media, that's certainly at play, or the objects that are available for the artist to use, but also this idea of consumption. And consumption is something, and it really depends on which pop artist you're talking about. Some of the pop artists really deal directly with issues of consumption. Some don't really. So that's gonna vary quite a bit. But one of the things that's very typical within pop art is to see how contemporary culture, especially visual culture, print media, is being incorporated into the works, again, in lots of different ways. So the first pop artist that we'll talk about is Robert Rauschenberg. So we're focusing primarily on Rauschenberg and Johns today. And this is a really early work by Rauschenberg. It's basically a cyanotype. Has anybody made a cyanotype? So a few people have. You want to talk about that process? So this, what I should say here is that we're seeing references to the body here, and this is life size. So we're looking at a big, sheet of paper. How do you make a cyanotype? Whoever wants to tackle that.
You coat the paper with the chemistry and then expose it to the light, and whatever object is on top of the paper, that chemistry will wash away to be white or like a light blue, depending on how long it's exposed.
Right. So in terms of when you look at this image, how would you assume this image is made?
You lay it on top of it.
Yeah. So because it's so it's a big it's got presence. And the thing about cyanotypes is that they're fairly commonly used as in art practice today. So again, some fairly contemporary thing. At the time when Rauschenberg makes this, cyanotypes are pretty much purely used for architects. And cyanotype, when you think of the blue line drawings, it's a process that's used. It's a printmaking process, but it was used in a much more commercial application, and usually in architectural for doing those architectural drawings, and sometimes like engineering and electrical, design in terms of making prints in that ways. So what Rauschenberg has done here is he's used a material that's that's been developed pretty much for a commercial process, and he's doing something new with it. At the time that he made this piece, he had also spent some time at a place in North Carolina. It was called Black Mountain College. And the Black Mountain College was founded in the 1930s, but then it closed in the early 1950s. And it was a very interesting place. There were remnants of it. I think in terms of this particular area, the attitudes and the kind of people who were there. I think there are parts of the college that in some ways still function. I think there's a Black Mountain Theater and so on that's kind of left over from the school having been there. It was founded by a art professor from Rollins College in Florida, and he basically got fed up with the traditional curriculum and moved to North Carolina and set up the school. He was trying to basically create a school with even by today's standards, with a very traditional curriculum, but it's interesting because it also has a lot of relevance today, because one of the things that he was really interested in, and people who were involved at Black Mountain College were really interested in, was working across boundaries, the kind of things we think of today as interdisciplinary, collaborative and team, learning and that kind of thing. So things that get bantered a lot in education today as being new, but in a lot of ways they're really just kind of old ideas. There were lots and lots of significant people, or people who turned out to be significant, who were either teaching at Black Mountain College or taking classes there or being a part of programs there. And a lot of people who really become significant in the late 50s and 60s often had these connections to Black Mountain College. So one of the people who came out of Black Mountain College was, why am I drawing a blank? Harley, I know you're interested in dance, modern dance choreographer. Do you know who I'm talking? I used to put you on the Martha Graham. Yeah, Martha Graham and Merce Cunningham, I think, both had connections to Black Mountain College as well. So one of the things when Rauschenberg was there, he was interested in and had connections to people who were doing dance. So we can look at this as a work of art, but it's referencing him crossing boundaries and being interested in the body and the movement of the body. And part of the reason why I reference this is because in some of his works, there are traces of the body, or there are traces of this presence that are in the work. So how this piece is formed is basically two people essentially, kind of placing themselves in positions onto the paper, and we get this. The image itself is really kind of a trace of that time that they're, and it's very dance-like. I think there's kind of almost a dance-like pattern to it. We can also see this kind of reference of the body, or the absence of the body, in some ways in this work here. And the story behind this is that, and this piece is mounted on the wall. It's an actual quilt and some sheets and a pillow that are essentially attached to, I'm not sure what the actual structure is of the support, but it's attached to a support and then it's framed and attached to the wall. And Rauschenberg talks about how, in later years, about how he had a cot in his studio where he would take naps, or sometimes he'd sleep in the studio when he was, kind of on these, working on for extended periods of time. And so it was, literally, the quilt that he was using and the pillow that he was using. But he ends up essentially, taking something that we think of as very functional and horizontal, and then, placing it onto the wall and considering it art. We could think about this in some ways in a Dadaist sense, as Neo-Dada, taking a functional object and presenting it to us in a way to where we consider it differently. And one of the things that I think is interesting to consider when you look at this work is that the pattern of the quilt is a pattern that's known as a log cabin quilt pattern. It has to do with the way that the pieces of fabric are sewn. In the one that's in his work is a simpler form where you can really see this repetition of the squares. Commonly, a log cabin quilt pattern, you'll see it like this, where you get these really kind of graphic patterns. And this is also a way where we see this idea of high art and low art coming into play as well. Because if you think about the history of modern art, especially through the 20th century, one of the big, and it kind of tends to split into two tracks, right? There's expressionism on one side and abstraction on the other. And when I say abstraction, I mean geometric abstraction. And when you look at a quilt, it's all about geometric abstraction. And a log cabin quilt pattern itself is an abstraction of the idea of a log cabin, of the individual, logs that, are pieced together or layered together, to make this three-dimensional structure. However, when we look at quilts, rarely do we talk about that in quilting. We don't talk about quilts generally, and until recent times, very recent times, they don't get talked about as art. They get put into this category of craft. They're also considered to be woman's work instead of serious man's work, right? And that's, patriarchal, language there. But it also puts them into this category of low art rather than high art. And so, and they're also this type of quilt is also quintessentially American as well. And we also know that in this post-war period, we've got artists who are interested in this notion of what is American art, what is the, what's the next great thing, what does it be, what does it mean to be an American artist. So that's kind of, that's a part of this work. The other thing too to consider is that in this time frame, Josef Albers is also a well-known individual. Albers he was trained in the Bauhaus in Germany. He was interested in design. And Albers was really interested in color and how color works. And he wrote a number of books on color and color studies for people who are really interested in color, who really want to know how color functions, and especially how we perceive color. They're still looking at Josef Albers' studies. And he did this whole huge, long series over decades. The other thing, too, about Albers that's important to know is he was also at Black Mountain College. And so Rauschenberg had a connection to him through that. But he did these series, they're mostly gouache paintings that are pretty modest in scale, called the Homage to the Square series. And he was essentially demonstrating how color functions when one color is placed next to another, how we perceive it, do forms seem to recede, kind of come towards us or move away, and so on. But because in the square itself, in this respect, doesn't really have any meaning. It's just a vehicle for studying color. But this repetition of the square, you can see that in Rauschenberg's work. And I've been very recently thinking about Albers because of the whole internet dress thing. Were you thinking about this? The dress that broke the internet. Let me come back to that. I think I got ahead of. Oh no, I thought I put it in here. I was going to show you. So sorry. I was going to show you an image. I'll try to remember to bring it in on Friday. One of the things that I really did. I must have not saved it. One of the things that Albers also did is he would take a single color, and he had these very interesting sort of diagrams. He would take two colors that are exactly the same, but place them in such a way next to other colors that when you looked at them, you would swear they were different colors. And it had to do with one color being placed next to, it had to do with how you perceived the color when it was adjacent to another color. So one of the things that he really talked about, or really demonstrated, was how we perceive color, and that how we perceive color can really vary quite a bit depending on the circumstances in which we're viewing the color. So I'll try to remember to bring all of this in on Friday. The other thing too, so we can talk about high art, low art, Americana, abstract, patterning and so on. But then when you look at Rauschenberg's bed, you've also got all of this paint, all over the surface of it, dripping and so on. And it's a reference to abstract expressionism, and a pretty direct reference to abstract expressionism. And Rauschenberg is of a younger generation, right? So he's coming on the heels of abstract expressionism. And he's and this is one of the things we'll see when hopefully I get the sound working, and we'll watch a snippet of him talking in the 70s, but he's talking broadly about his career. And he talks specifically about the abstract expressionists, and he talks about, kind of their place and position, and that he's trying to not be them, essentially. So in a sense, with Rauschenberg, he's combining all of these things together. And, high, low, art, making references to various forms, but using real, functional things or real functional objects. So this idea of combining and bringing things together, or we can even also bring in, Dada and Duchamp into the mix, is really significant. And he made a number of works that we would think of as mixed media pieces or even sculpture, mixed media sculpture. But he referred to them as paintings, and he called them calm mind paintings. And he was combining, so he's literally combining things that he finds. And keep in mind, he's a scrappy New York artist. He's collecting things, picking up stuff, finding things. So here we've got a taxidermied goat and a tire and scrap pieces of wood. And it's hard to see in this image, but there's even some pages from magazines on that. It's a platform-like surface. It's almost base-like in a way, that are kind of layered in the image itself. It's all of this stuff that's in his life, that's around him, and it's kind of stuff that's in New York City as well. I think another thing that, because I mentioned New York, is also important to think about. Going to New York City today is a very different experience from what it was since kind of the 1980s and before, and especially as you get into as you're getting closer to the 1960s, New York was really rough. And I mean, there's always rough parts in New York, but traveling in New York today is a whole different experience than it was in the past. It's a lot cleaner city. It's a lot safer city than it was, even 20 years ago or so. And there was also a lot of discussion in this time frame that the city was kind of crumbling and falling apart and gritty and, dangerous in a lot of places. And there's some people who felt like maybe the city had peaked and, was kind of on its decline. So that's something that's also running in the background. That, again, I think the way we experience New York today is very different post-1980s and post-Giuliani, because he made it one of his primary job was to make New York safer and cleaner, and keep tourism, keep the tourism dollars, flowing into the city too. So this work is coming out of that dynamic, and I think that's really important to consider, because it is a bunch of junk basically that's being brought together. This work here is called Ree Business, and it's similar, except instead of being placed in a sculptural way, like a platform with objects on it, it is placed on the wall. And it's also, but you could think of it as a kind of combined painting. It is a combination of a lot of things. There's, traditional materials and paint, but there's also images that are all coming from, some are little prints, others are cut out of magazines, and they're all referencing contemporary culture, but they're also referencing the history of art as well. If you look carefully, and I've got my pointer, if you look carefully here, you see Botticelli's Birth of Venus, right, is referenced. You also see all these color swatches here, running across the surface. So there's, references, to art and artistic practice. And this always reads to me almost as a kind of timeline in a way. Like you're seeing, this, but it doesn't necessarily function in that way. And it's a pretty big work. Got another image here that shows it in a gallery setting, so you get a little better sense of a scale. Does anybody know what the word rebus means? Is that familiar at all? It's an interesting word. A rebus this is the official definition of it, right? So it's an illusional device that uses words and images to represent a word. And so it's this kind of thing. This is a photograph. This is a bottle cap from a Lone Star beer. So if you drink Lone Star beer, you should always look under the bottle cap because you'll find these things. And basically, this, if you can interpret this as a phrase, and it's a phrase that you probably have some familiarity with. Let me figure it out. Yeah, so who buys this? What's that?
Who buys this brand?
Not a brand. What did you say? brand, right? Who buys this round? Right? So it's me doing it. Oh yeah, see, it's circle around. You have to really kind of alter the way you think. I am no good at figuring these things out generally. I had a friend who used to love Lone Star beer just because of the bottle caps, and so he had this collection of these things, and I'd flip through them, and he loved to figure them out, and sometimes it would like take me forever, or I'd just give up. But you always have to kind of think differently, right? Because what you're doing is you're combining images of things like the owl and the eye. You also have letters, that represent ideas, but they also and in that circle too, but they also represent ideas as well. So the owl doesn't mean owl; it means who, because we make this association between owls and the sounds that they make. So they're simple but really complicated all at the same time. And they function, image and text in this way. It's a strange amalgamation of things, but it's one thing referencing something else, and we're using image and text in a way that we don't normally use it in a traditional way. And so that's essentially what Rauschenberg's image is doing. I mean, it's a kind of puzzle that you have to figure out, and he's using a lot of contemporary imagery, especially print media, and he's a painter and sculptor, but he also makes screen prints as well. And screen printing really, as a process, really lends itself well to this into this kind of imagery. The example of one of his screen prints that's in your textbook is a state that's on the left. But I also wanted to show you retroactive from 1964, so a year later, because it's probably one of his best-known prints. If you look at Rauschenberg print, probably this one, if you were to do Google searches on this one, it's probably going to come up pretty, probably at the top of the list. What he was doing in these, and some of these are relatively small, and some of them are huge. We'll get a sense of that when we watch the video on Friday. And what he was doing was collecting, images from print media, and then, screen printing itself is a photographic, process. You have an image that you can burn onto the screen, and then print that form. So in a way, they're kind of combinations of prints and paintings as well, because some of these, each image that you see here is a particular screen. Some of them are relatively small. Some are relatively big as well. With a state, in a lot of ways, it's a reference to New York itself. The kind of jumbled, kind of imagery that you would see of New York. For retroactive, it's a reference to American culture, especially in 1964. When you look at this image, especially outside of the context of the year, when you look at this image, what ideas come to mind, or what thoughts come to mind? What associations do you make between the things that you see? Who's represented? Let's start there. Kennedy, right? And what else do we see that's recognizable? An astronaut, right? So what's the connection between Kennedy and astronauts? Space race. Right, the space program, right? He makes this huge push to, the space race and so on, that we're going to, compete head to head, with the Soviets, and Americans are going to walk on the moon, right? That's our challenge, that we're going to do it before anybody else, does it. So we've got, this imagery. What happens in 1964 to Kennedy? He's assassinated, right? So he's killed in 1964. And the interesting thing about this particular image, in later years when Rauschenberg talked about it, he said that when he first started working on the image, it was before Kennedy was assassinated. The other thing about Rauschenberg, too, is he was really fascinated with the space program. And he went to, I don't know how many, initially they were, the launch of the capsule or missile, I don't know if that's the right word for them, because we had whatever it was before the space shuttle program. They're not missiles, not the right word.
Rocket.
What rocket? Yeah, I guess that'll work. So we went to I guess they're all rockets. And anyway, I'm getting caught up in words. But over decades, he went down to Florida and actually watched, lots of, launches, space vehicles, launches of space vehicles. So it was something that he personally was really interested, starting, from this time period when he was a younger man. But he says that when he first started this, working on this image, what he was interested in was Kennedy as this young president. He was really dynamic. That was really, the world seemed like it was changing for the better, even though there's a lot of conflict. The reference to the space race seemed, really, romantic and, big and bold and so on. And so those were the ideas initially when he was working on it. But while he was in the middle of this project, Kennedy is assassinated. And everything, really seemed to fall apart. And that's also something to consider during the 60s, is so many people were assassinated, right? Kennedy's assassinated, his brother's assassinated, Martin Luther King is assassinated, all within a couple of years. And for a lot of people, it really felt like America was tearing itself apart and really kind of coming apart at the seams. And in a later interview, he also talked about how, Kennedy represented hope for the future, and then suddenly he was a dead tragedy. I think that's kind of roughly, the words that he uses. So, and the other thing he talked about too, and again, this is, a much later time frame, was how the images themselves, and these are all images taken out of the media, don't change. I mean, certainly he arranges them in a certain way. They don't change, but our meaning changes and our understanding of this imagery changes. And so how we bring meaning to the image is really significant. The two of the other images that you see in here, they're a little hard to read. This is probably taken from like a grocery store flyer, and it's looks upside down. But can you recognize what those are? Yeah, they're apples, right? So we're looking at like a display of apples, but again, it's upside down. I think it's notable. This one is really hard to read because the image purposely is distorted. But it's a reference to Masaccio's. So we go back to the Renaissance, to fresco painting by Masaccio from the Brancacci Chapel, and it's one just piece of it, and it's the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So it's Adam and Eve getting forced out of the garden, and so that kind of comes in, and those are images that are added after Kennedy's assassination. So literally, he's in the middle of working on this thing. So suddenly, it goes from this possibility for like maybe a new Eden, a new American Eden, this place of greater perfection, to everything falling apart. So that like the Garden of Eden, changes.